Hello everyone, welcome to Nightmare Chronicles. If you're enjoying the story, drop a like and hit subscribe button. Your support really motivates me to create more videos like this. I've always been drawn to unusual things, objects with history, secrets, anything with a story to tell. But after what happened to me, I wish I'd left one thing well alone. I found it in a small, dusty antique shop while traveling through a quiet town. It was an old mask, beautifully carved, covered in strange, swirling designs that seemed to ripple in the light. The shopkeeper eyed me warily when I picked it up, warning me that it was the Watcher's mask, used in ritual ceremonies centuries ago. She said it was cursed, tied to something ancient and dark. I should have listened, but my curiosity overpowered my caution. I bought it, thinking it would make a unique addition to my collection, and drove home, the mask nestled carefully in the passenger seat. But as I drove, I began to feel watched. Every now and then I'd glance over, half expecting to see someone sitting beside me. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the eerie design. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. Once home, I hung it on my wall, admiring how it seemed to glow in the low light. I couldn't explain it, but something about the mask drew me in, as if it had a presence all its own. That night, I dreamed of shadowy figures, their faces blurred, staring at me in silence. I could feel their eyes, cold and piercing, and every time I turned away, I'd find myself back in their gaze. When I woke up, I found myself standing in front of the mask, my hand outstretched as though I'd been about to touch it. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten there, but the mask's carved eyes seemed to watch me, to know me. The dreams grew worse, more vivid. I started seeing the shadows while I was awake, faint figures moving in my peripheral vision, disappearing whenever I turned. And every time, I'd find myself staring at the mask, unable to look away. It felt as though it was alive, hungry for something I didn't understand. My friends grew concerned. I stopped sleeping, barely eating, my thoughts haunted by the mask and the shadows that came with it. I tried to put it away, to cover it or store it in the attic, but the mask would somehow always end up back on the wall, exactly where I'd first hung it. One night, as I lay half asleep, I felt something cold brush against my face. My eyes snapped open, and there it was, lying beside me on the pillow, its empty eyes staring into mine. I froze, paralyzed with terror. My hand trembled as I reached out, gripping it tightly. It felt warm, as though it had been breathing, watching me as I slept. That's when I knew I had to get rid of it. I drove to a nearby lake, determined to drown the cursed thing. But as I stood at the water's edge, a strange voice filled my head, soft and persuasive, whispering that the mask was part of me now, that it had seen me, claimed me. My grip loosened, and for a moment, I almost slipped it over my face, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't understand. Fighting the urge, I hurled it into the lake, watching it sink below the surface, the ripples fading. I left, relieved, though something gnawed at me, a feeling that it wasn't truly over. In the days that followed, I tried to return to normal life, but the nightmares returned, worse than ever. In every dream I saw myself wearing the mask, standing among the shadowed figures, watching with those same empty eyes. I'd wake, sweating, feeling as though I'd just peeled the mask off my own face. One evening, I was sitting in my living room when I heard a soft knock at my door. I opened it, and there on my doorstep lay the mask, soaking wet, with lakeweeds clinging to its surface. It was back, and this time, I knew there was no escaping it. I've come to understand that it doesn't just want to be worn, it wants me to become part of it. Every time I see it, the urge to put it on grows stronger. As I write this, I feel the weight of its gaze behind me, pulling me closer. I don't know how much longer I can resist, but if you're reading this, please heed my warning. Never touch the Watcher's mask, because once it sees you, it never stops watching. They say that fate deals everyone a hand, but few expect it to deal from a cursed deck of cards. I found this out the hard way. I was never much of a gambler, but after losing my job and facing bills I couldn't pay, I felt I had nothing left to lose. A friend of mine, Jack, was the one who introduced me to the underground poker scene in town. It wasn't exactly legal, but that didn't seem to bother him, or anyone else who gathered in that dimly lit, smoke-filled basement. When I showed up that night, Jack was nowhere to be found. Instead, I was greeted by a quiet old man who eyed me with what I can only describe as amusement, like he already knew everything about me. He sat alone at a table with an unusual deck of cards, which I couldn't help but notice. They were dark, worn down, with strange markings on the backs that resembled symbols or even hieroglyphs. I couldn't resist asking him about them. "This deck," he said in a low, gravelly voice, "is special. It gives you what you desire, but always for a price." I laughed, thinking he was just trying to scare me, but he looked dead serious. "I'll make you a deal," he whispered. "Play one hand with me. If you win, you get all the money on the table, but if you lose..." He trailed off, his eyes glinting. I shrugged. How hard could one hand be? So I agreed, and he dealt. From the moment the cards were in my hand, something felt wrong. The cards were cold, almost icy, and I could swear I heard faint whispers, like voices trapped within each one. My heart pounded as I looked at my hand. A full house. A fantastic hand. I couldn't believe my luck. But when I glanced up, the old man's expression turned sinister, his smile stretching wider than it should. He laid down his hand, 4 aces, an impossible win. Just as I opened my mouth to protest, a sudden pain shot through my chest. I felt like something was squeezing the life out of me. Gasping, I looked down and saw my reflection in the polished wood of the table. My face looked hollow, pale, like something was draining the very essence from me. I stumbled back, dropping the cards, but the pain remained, sharp and unrelenting. The man leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper, yet somehow louder than the ringing in my ears. "The deck chooses whom it keeps," he said, gathering up the cards one by one, each of them returning to the stack with a whisper. When I finally managed to stand up, the man and the deck were gone, as if they'd never been there. I chalked it up to some hallucination, maybe nerves, but the strange effects followed me home. Over the next few days, my luck turned from bad to worse. Every decision I made seemed cursed. My car broke down on a desolate road. A small fire started in my kitchen out of nowhere. My dog, who'd never bitten anyone, suddenly snapped at me. And then every night I'd find a single card from the old man's deck on my bedside table, waiting for me. First, it was the Ace of Spades, then the Queen of Hearts, each card more menacing than the last. I tried everything to get rid of them, tearing them up, burning them, even throwing them in the river. But they always reappeared, pristine, on my nightstand by morning. Eventually, I realized what I had to do. I had to finish the game. I returned to that underground poker den, desperate to find the man and end whatever curse he'd laid on me. But no one had ever heard of him. No one had even seen that deck. In a panic, I searched every game in town, asking anyone who would listen about the mysterious old man with the strange cards. Finally, after weeks of searching, I found myself in a seedy bar where a group of gamblers sat in silence. As I described the man and his deck, one of them turned pale. "You've met the dealer," he whispered, barely able to look at me. He explained that the dealer was a legend in gambling circles, said to carry a cursed deck that binds its victims to him until they pay a debt no one can ever settle. As he spoke, I noticed a familiar glint at the edge of the table. The cursed deck itself, lying face down. I didn't even have to touch it to feel the pull. A dark, invisible force reaching out for me. Unable to resist, I sat down and picked up the cards. They felt colder than ice, the whispers now a chorus, louder and more menacing. My only way out was to play, but this time, I knew better than to bet anything material. Instead, I offered the one thing I had left, my soul. The dealer appeared across from me as if he'd been there all along, his smile calm and knowing. With every card he dealt, the whispers grew louder, the air thickening around us. My hands trembled as I laid down my cards, a royal flush. My breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I thought I had won, but the dealer merely chuckled, flipping over his hand to reveal 5 kings. An impossible hand, a laugh in the face of reality. And then I felt it, a cold, creeping sensation enveloping my body as my vision blurred and my heartbeat slowed. The dealer gathered the cards, his voice fading as he said, "The deck takes what it wants." The last thing I saw was his hand reaching for mine, sealing the deal. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back in my apartment, but something was horribly wrong. My reflection stared back at me from every mirror with dead, hollow eyes, a ghostly grin stretched across my face. And there, beside me, lay the cursed deck, waiting for its next victim. I never believed in cursed objects, much less in haunted dolls, until I inherited one from my late grandmother. She was an eccentric woman, known for her odd collection of antiques and strange beliefs. When the lawyer handed me the doll, a porcelain figure with glassy, unblinking eyes, and a red dress that seemed too bright, too garish for something so old, he looked visibly uncomfortable, as if he too was unnerved by it. My grandmother had called it Lucy, and there were rules that came with it. Never leave her in the dark, always place her facing a window, and never, under any circumstances, look directly into her eyes in the mirror. I laughed it off, thinking it was one of my grandmother's peculiar quirks, but as soon as I brought Lucy into my home, I felt her presence. It wasn't just the doll itself, it was something heavier, something that pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. On the first night, I placed Lucy on a shelf in my living room, facing the large window as instructed, and went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing small tapping sounds, the faint scrape of tiny feet across the floor. I brushed it off as settling noises until I went to check and found Lucy no longer facing the window. She was turned slightly, her glass eyes fixed on the doorway, as though waiting for me. I quickly put her back in place and tried to ignore it, but it happened again and again. Each night, I found her in a slightly different position, her eyes following me no matter where I moved. It was disturbing, yet I convinced myself that it had to be a trick of my mind or a prank played by someone. But then, things began to escalate. Objects started to go missing, small items at first, like my keys or a hairpin. One morning, I found a note in my own handwriting that I hadn't written, with a single word on it. "Hello." As the days passed, Lucy's presence grew more invasive. Her eyes, once dull and cold, seemed to gleam with a strange intelligence, as if she were studying me. I tried to avoid looking at her, but the rules kept me bound. I had to leave her facing the window, and as per my grandmother's instruction, I dared not look directly into her eyes in a mirror. But curiosity, or maybe foolishness, got the better of me. One night, while dusting, I lifted Lucy to move her to a different shelf, and I caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her face in the glass was not the same. In the reflection, her mouth had twisted into a horrible grin, and her eyes seemed to bulge with malevolent glee. I dropped her, heart pounding, but when I looked down, the doll was in her original position, her expression serene once more. But that was when things turned sinister. That night, I woke up to find Lucy in my bedroom, seated at the foot of my bed, though I had left her downstairs. I tried to pick her up, to throw her away, but she was unnaturally heavy, as if rooted to the spot. I heard a faint giggle, childlike but chilling, coming from somewhere close. I rushed out, locked her in a trunk, and decided I had to get rid of her. The next morning, I took Lucy to a local thrift shop, hoping to leave her behind and be done with it. But the clerk's face paled when I handed her the doll, and she refused to take it. She told me a local legend about a cursed doll named Lucy, believed to be inhabited by a vengeful spirit. Lucy, she said, had been passed down through generations, always bringing tragedy to her owners until they either died or gave her away. The only way to truly rid myself of her was to find someone willing to take her, or else, well, no one knew for sure. But no one who'd tried to abandon Lucy had escaped her. Desperate, I took Lucy to an antique shop known for handling strange items. The owner took one look at the doll and shook his head, saying he wouldn't dare keep her in his store. By now, I was at my wit's end. I couldn't keep her, but I didn't want to pass her curse on to someone else. I went back home, unsure of what to do, but as I entered, I found Lucy waiting for me by the front door. Her face cracked in places, with small red stains around her mouth that hadn't been there before. Panic surged through me, and I made a final decision. I drove out to a remote area, dug a deep hole, and buried her, hoping it would end the curse. As I covered the last bit of dirt, I felt a chill run through me, a faint whisper on the wind that sounded like laughter. I drove home, feeling relief wash over me, but when I opened my door, I froze. Lucy was sitting on my couch, her dress pristine, her glass eyes reflecting a twisted version of my own terrified face. I knew at that moment that I was her last owner. There would be no escape. I was never one to believe in curses or haunted objects, but when I received the doll, something in my life changed, and not for the better. It started when my grandmother passed away. She left me an old wooden box filled with her jewelry, trinkets, and an eerie porcelain doll. The doll was small, barely larger than my hand, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to follow me, no matter where I stood. Its face was delicately painted, but its expression was odd, too lifelike, almost frozen in a look of deep sadness or fear. My grandmother had always been a collector, but I never remembered her mentioning this doll, nor had I seen it in her collection. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off as an overactive imagination. I set the doll on my shelf, thinking nothing of it. That night, however, I awoke to a strange noise, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. I flicked on the light, scanning the room, only to find the doll in a different position. It was now facing my bed, though I distinctly remembered placing it facing the window. In the following days, the disturbances grew. Every night, without fail, the doll would somehow shift positions. Sometimes it would be sitting up, other times lying on its side, once even facing away, as if it didn't want to be seen. I began to feel uneasy in my own room, the doll's silent gaze watching me. I tried to ignore it, but I started feeling a weight on my chest each night, a growing dread as I drifted into sleep. My dreams were filled with strange visions of a dollmaker hunched over his workbench, crafting dolls that looked like trapped souls. In these dreams, I could feel the doll's sadness, as though it were pleading for something. As the nights went on, I grew sleep-deprived, jumpy, and nervous. One morning, I woke to find scratches on my arms, like tiny claw marks. My heart raced as I looked around, seeing the doll in its usual place, but I knew it was somehow responsible. Desperate for answers, I began digging into the doll's origins, and the search led me to a peculiar story. The doll had belonged to a woman named Eliza, a distant ancestor who had a daughter that died young. In her grief, she went to a dollmaker known for his magical creations, asking him to craft a doll in her daughter's likeness. But the dollmaker was rumored to dabble in dark magic, and he supposedly trapped a piece of the girl's spirit in the doll to keep her alive. After the dollmaker vanished, families who owned the doll reported eerie happenings, hearing whispers, feeling watched, and even finding marks on their skin. The doll, it seemed, held the restless spirit of Eliza's daughter, trapped in an endless loop of sorrow and anger. One night, I reached my breaking point. I woke to the sensation of someone's icy breath on my face. My eyes flew open, and there, in the dim light, I saw the doll standing upright on my nightstand, staring down at me. Its eyes no longer seemed like glass. They were vivid, filled with emotion, as if someone was peering out from behind them. I could feel a wave of anger and despair rolling off it, and I knew it wanted something. In a frenzy, I grabbed the doll and threw it into the basement, locking the door behind me. But as I returned to my room, the whispers began again, louder now, as if pleading, crying for release. I could feel its sadness, its hatred, and I knew I had to get rid of it. The next day, I took the doll to an antique shop known for dealing with cursed objects. The owner, an elderly man with a knowing look, took one glance at the doll and nodded grimly. "This isn't something you can just throw away," he said. "It has a soul, and it's been trapped for far too long." He told me that the only way to set it free was to return it to where it was made, the Dollmaker's old workshop, which had become a ruin over the years. Reluctantly, I agreed. That night, I drove out to the abandoned workshop, a decrepit building on the edge of town, now overgrown with ivy and weeds. I stood there, holding the doll, feeling its sadness deepen as I neared the building. Inside, I found a dusty workbench, scattered with remnants of old doll parts and decayed wood. Placing the doll down, I whispered a quiet farewell, feeling an odd sense of closure as I did. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint, childlike giggle, followed by a whisper. "Thank you." I left the workshop that night feeling the weight lift from my chest. The nightmares ceased, the scratches healed, and my life returned to normal. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see her face, staring out from those porcelain eyes, finally at peace. It was a small-town legend, really, a story I thought was made up to scare the kids. Growing up, we'd heard about the crying doll hidden somewhere in the old Sawyer house. It was abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. But the story went that in the 1920s, a little girl named Annabelle was given a doll by her father. It wasn't just any doll. It was one of those Victorian porcelain dolls, with eyes that seemed too real and a mouth that looked ready to whisper secrets. The girl adored it, but as the story went, the doll began to change her. Neighbors claimed they heard her talking to it, crying over it, saying it spoke back. One day, both she and the doll disappeared. The house sat empty, and kids dared each other to go in, but nobody actually did, until I did, that is. It was Halloween night, and my friends thought it would be funny to go find the crying doll. With nothing but our phone flashlights, we pushed open the creaking door, the air thick with dust, and a strange, heavy silence. We made our way up to the attic, where the doll was supposed to be, the boards creaking under our feet. I can still remember the feeling I had as we reached the top, the sense that we were no longer alone. In the corner, beneath a pile of rotting cloth and broken furniture, was a box. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to open it. My friends stayed back, but I knelt down, pulling aside the cloth, and there it was, lying face down, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The doll. It was just as creepy as the stories had said. Pale face, big eyes with dark pupils that seemed to follow you. I don't know what compelled me, but I took it, intending to keep it as a sort of proof, a trophy of our night. The air felt colder when I picked it up, and my friends quickly made excuses to leave, laughing nervously. That night, I put the doll on my dresser, telling myself it was just a silly old toy. But when I woke up around midnight, the doll was no longer on the dresser. I found it at the foot of my bed, its eyes staring right at me. A chill ran down my spine as I picked it up and put it back on the dresser, convincing myself I must have moved it in my sleep. But the next morning, it was back at the foot of my bed again. And this time, I noticed something disturbing. Its porcelain cheeks were stained as if it had been crying. Things began to escalate after that. I started hearing faint whispers at night, a soft, weeping sound like a child's cry. I thought I was going mad, but every time I checked the doll, its face seemed somehow different, more alive. One morning, I woke up to find scratches on my arms, faint but unmistakable, like tiny clawed fingers had raked across my skin. I tried to get rid of it. I put it in a box in the garage, but that night it was back on my dresser, staring at me with its cold, lifeless eyes. Terrified, I researched everything I could about cursed dolls, hoping to find a way to rid myself of it. In my search, I came across something that stopped me cold. A news article about the Sawyer house from nearly a century ago. It mentioned Annabelle's disappearance and her father's desperate search for her. According to the report, the father claimed the doll had somehow possessed her, leading her away from the family. People wrote it off as the ravings of a grief-stricken man, but I knew there had to be more to it. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the crying again, louder this time, coming from right beside me. I looked over, and there, on the pillow next to mine, lay the doll, staring at me with a malevolent glint in its eyes. Panicked, I threw it out the window, desperate to be free of it. But when I turned around, it was lying on my bed, somehow untouched, as if it had never left. I realized then that I was trapped. The doll wouldn't let me go. Over the next few days, the crying got louder, filling every corner of my house, following me wherever I went. I started seeing her too. Annabelle, a shadowy figure with sad eyes, standing just out of reach, watching me. I was barely sleeping, barely eating, consumed by the doll's presence. In my desperation, I reached out to a priest, begging him to bless the doll. He was hesitant, clearly unnerved, but he agreed. During the blessing, the doll's eyes seemed to narrow, its face twisting into something angry, something dark. The room grew icy, and we both heard it, the faint, chilling cry of a child echoing through the room. The priest advised me to bury it deep in the ground where it couldn't hurt anyone else. That night, under the pale light of the moon, I drove to the woods, digging frantically in the dirt, feeling like I was being watched the whole time. I buried it as deep as I could, covering it with stones, hoping it would be enough. As I drove away, I could still hear the faint, eerie cry echoing through the trees. Even now, I wonder if she's still out there, crying for someone to bring her home, or if, someday, the doll will find its way back to me.